The morning air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the simmering frustration Victor felt brewing within him. Sunlight dappled through the leaves of the towering oak trees lining his street, painting shifting patterns on the asphalt. He stood by his living room window, coffee mug warming his hands, a knot tightening in his chest as he watched her approach. The sleek, black SUV, the same one that had blocked his driveway the previous night, glided to a stop a few houses down. A woman emerged, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a crisp white blouse clinging to her frame. It was her, the neighbor he'd yet to formally meet, the one he now recognized as the source of his simmering unease. Caroline. He'd heard whispers of her on the neighborhood online forum, the HOA president, efficient, some might say ruthless. He took a deep breath, the scent of coffee momentarily overriding the metallic tang of anxiety that coated his tongue. He had to address this. This was his home, his driveway. He set the mug down, its gentle clink echoing the tremor in his hand. He smoothed down his shirt, a futile attempt to quell the disquiet that rippled through him. What if she was unreasonable? What if this escalated into a neighborhood feud? He pushed the thought away. He wasn't looking for a fight, just a resolution, a simple understanding. He stepped out onto his porch, the wooden planks creaking beneath his weight, a sound that felt oddly amplified in the otherwise still morning. He walked down his driveway, each step deliberate, measured. He could feel his pulse thrumming in his temples, a steady rhythm against the backdrop of chirping birds and the distant hum of traffic. As he neared her, he forced a smile, hoping it conveyed polite firmness rather than the apprehension churning within. "Excuse me, ma'am, that your SUV?" he asked, his voice steadier than he expected. Caroline turned, her expression shifting from a pleasant, neighborly smile to a cool appraisal. Her eyes, a sharp, icy blue, scanned him from head to toe, a silent inventory that left him feeling strangely exposed. He wondered if she was assessing his perceived threat level, gauging his willingness to back down. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. Perhaps he should have worn something more authoritative. He dismissed it as quickly as it came. He wasn't playing a game of dominance. "Oh, yes," she replied, her voice smooth, almost melodic. "Just left it there for a bit. I figured it wouldn't be a problem." She gestured vaguely towards his driveway, a dismissive flick of her wrist. The casualness of her tone grated on him. "It was blocking my car in last night," he said, keeping his voice even, though a flicker of irritation sparked within him. He could feel his carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. "Oh, really?" she said, a faint lift of her perfectly sculpted eyebrow. It was a subtle expression, easily missed, but to Victor, it spoke volumes. It was the look of someone accustomed to getting their way, of someone who viewed minor inconveniences to others as simply the cost of their own convenience. "I was only there for a short while. We're usually quite flexible around here." The word flexible hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Flexible for whom? He wondered. He took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He hadn't moved across the country for the tranquility of suburban life, only to find himself embroiled in a petty parking war. "I understand," he said, forcing another smile, this one feeling strained even to him. "But I'd appreciate it if you didn't park on my driveway again. It's a bit inconvenient, you see." He gestured towards his house, a silent plea for understanding. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, annoyance? Impatience? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a carefully neutral mask. "Well, I'm on the HOA board," she said, her tone shifting, taking on a subtle edge. The implication was clear. Her position granted her certain privileges. The unspoken addendum hung heavy in the air. "And you are not." He felt a surge of frustration, a hot, prickly sensation that crawled up his neck. This wasn't about flexibility, it was about power. "I understand," he said again, his voice tighter now, the forced politeness wearing thin. He could feel the tension radiating off her in waves. "But the driveway is part of my property. Regardless of HOA regulations, I'd prefer it if people didn't park there." He held her gaze, a silent challenge. He was trying to be reasonable, but he wouldn't be walked over. A tight smile stretched across her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice smooth as silk, yet laced with a subtle dismissal. She turned, her attention already shifting elsewhere, as if the conversation was already over, as if his concerns were nothing more than a minor annoyance, a buzzing fly to be swatted away. He watched her walk away. The click of her heels on the pavement, a sharp punctuation marked their encounter. He stood there for a moment, the morning sun warm on his face, the scent of pine and damp earth doing little to soothe the simmering anger that now replaced his initial anxiety. He felt a strange mix of emotions, frustration, disappointment, and a prickle of unease. This wasn't over. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, a cold, heavy weight. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. The crisp morning air, tinged with the scent of pine from the neighbor's towering evergreen, did little to soothe the simmering frustration coiling in Victor's chest. Sunlight, sharp and clear, glinted off the chrome bumper of the familiar silver sedan parked squarely in his driveway. Again, Caroline's silver sedan. He stood by his kitchen window, a mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in his hand, the ceramic cold against his palm. It had only been a week in his new home, a week he'd envisioned filled with unpacking and settling in, not petty neighborhood squabbles. Yet, here he was, trapped in a silent battle of wills over a patch of concrete. He could almost hear the faint, mocking echo of Caroline's voice, condescending and dismissive, from their previous encounter. "Just for a little while, dear." The meeting ran long. A little while that had stretched into hours the first time, and now, this a blatant disregard for his clearly stated request. The casual arrogance of it grated on him. He had tried to be reasonable, understanding even. New to the neighborhood, he didn't want to start on the wrong foot. But this felt deliberately provocative. He set the mug down on the counter, the quiet clink echoing the unsettling quiet in his mind, a quiet preceding a storm. He felt a strange detachment, as though watching himself from a distance. Was this how it would be? A constant struggle, a silent war waged over parking spaces and unspoken territorial claims? The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth, sharper than the strongest coffee. He retrieved his phone from the kitchen counter, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat building inside him. He opened the camera app, the lens focusing on the offending vehicle, capturing the scene with cold precision. Each click of the shutter felt like a small victory, a documentation of the transgression, a piece of ammunition for the war he hadn't intended to fight. He zoomed in on the license plate, ensuring clarity. This wasn't just about the inconvenience. This was about principle, about respect, about drawing a line in the sand. The image on the screen seemed to mock him, a symbol of his powerlessness in the face of Caroline's casual disregard. The thought kindled a low, steady burn of anger, a controlled burn that threatened to ignite. He took a deep breath, the cool morning air doing little to extinguish the flames. He had a choice. He could let it slide, chalk it up to another instance of neighborly inconsideration, and stew in his resentment. Or he could escalate. He could involve the HOA, the very organization Caroline seemed to believe granted her immunity from common courtesy. He imagined the conversation, the carefully worded complaint, the inevitable denial and defensiveness from Caroline. He could almost see her dismissive wave of her hand, hear the patronizing tone she'd undoubtedly employ. The thought brought a fresh wave of anger, a burning tide that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed composure. He closed his eyes, trying to regain control, to quell the rising tide of frustration. This wasn't him. He wasn't someone who sought conflict. He valued peace, tranquility. But how could he find peace when his own driveway was constantly under siege? He opened his eyes, the scene unchanged. The silver sedan remained, a gleaming symbol of Caroline's disregard. He felt a strange sense of detachment again, as though watching himself from outside his body. Was this what it meant to own a home? To be constantly vigilant, defending your territory against encroaching neighbors? He thought of the quiet evenings he'd envisioned, sitting on his porch, enjoying the sunset. Those evenings seemed a distant dream now, replaced by the harsh reality of this silent conflict. The image of Caroline, her condescending smile, her dismissive words, flashed through his mind. He could almost hear her voice echoing in the stillness of his home, a constant reminder of her transgression. The simmering anger, carefully banked, flared anew. He turned away from the window, a decision solidifying in his mind. He would escalate. He would not allow himself to be bullied, intimidated, or disregarded. He wouldn't let Caroline, or anyone else, steal the peace he had so carefully cultivated. He would fight for his right to enjoy his home, his property, his driveway. He walked away from the window. The image of the silver sedan burned into his memory. He wouldn't forget this. He wouldn't let it go. The quiet war had escalated, and he was ready. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in Victor's meticulously organized kitchen. Sunlight, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes across the granite countertop where a half-finished mug of coffee sat, cooling. He stared at it, the rising steam a phantom echo of his dissipating patience. It had been 3 weeks since he moved into this quiet, leafy suburb, seeking a sanctuary from the city's incessant noise. 3 weeks since the war of attrition began. He had initially attributed Caroline's parking transgressions to simple oversight, a momentary lapse in neighborly consideration. Now, however, a pattern was emerging, one woven with threads of deliberate provocation. First, it was the carefully placed flyer on proper lawn maintenance tucked under his doormat, the subtext barely concealed beneath the veneer of HOA regulations. His lawn, meticulously manicured, was beyond reproach. Then came the anonymous complaint about his garbage cans, left out 5 minutes past the designated collection time. Each incident, small in itself, pricked at him like 1,000 tiny needles. He picked up his phone, the smooth glass cool against his palm. The photos he'd taken earlier of Caroline's monstrous SUV parked squarely across his driveway mocked him from the screen. The video, capturing the blatant disregard as she stepped out, her face a mask of serene indifference, fueled the simmering anger in his chest. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but a colder, more calculating part of him held back. There was a game being played, and he refused to play by her rules. The next morning, Victor rose before the sun. A strange calm had settled over him, replacing the restless frustration of the previous weeks. He went out to his garage, a plan forming in his mind. He carefully positioned his own car, a classic vintage Mustang he'd painstakingly restored, directly in the center of his driveway, effectively blocking any access. It was a blatant, almost childish move, but he needed to know, with absolute certainty, the extent of her audacity. He retreated back inside, the quiet rhythm of his breathing echoing the ticking clock. He didn't have to wait long. The familiar rumble of Caroline's SUV announced her arrival. He watched from behind the curtains as she braked abruptly, her head snapping forward. A flicker of annoyance, quickly replaced by a steely resolve, crossed her face. He saw her lips move, mouthing words he couldn't hear, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. She parked, again, right behind his car, effectively boxing him in. Victor felt a strange detachment, as if observing the scene from a distance. He picked up his phone, his hands steady, and took more photos, more videos. This was no longer about a parking space. This was about power, about territory. This was about breaking him. He thought back to his childhood, to the relentless bullying he'd endured. The same suffocating feeling of helplessness, the same creeping dread that had haunted him then, threatened to consume him now. He wouldn't allow it. He had spent years building walls around himself, brick by painstaking brick, creating a fortress of self-reliance. This petty territorial dispute wouldn't breach those walls. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the bitter aroma filling his senses. He had to change tactics. Politeness, he realized, was a language Caroline didn't understand. He needed to speak her language, the language of consequence. The next few days were a blur of meticulously documented violations. Every parking infraction, every passive-aggressive note left on his windshield, Every whispered comment exchanged between Caroline and her allies on the HOA board was recorded, cataloged, and stored. He was building a case, brick by digital brick. He knew it was bordering on obsessive, but he couldn't stop. It was more than just the parking now. It was about reclaiming the sense of control that had been so subtly, so insidiously eroded. One evening, as he sat on his porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across his lawn, a wave of weariness washed over him. He looked at the meticulously maintained flower beds, at the freshly painted porch swing, at the quiet serenity he had so desperately sought. Was this it? Was this his life now? A constant battle against the pettiness of suburban warfare? He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. The faint scent of jasmine, planted by the previous owner, reached him, a fragile reminder of the peace he craved. He opened his eyes, a newfound resolve hardening his gaze. He wouldn't be driven out. He wouldn't be bullied. He wouldn't surrender his small piece of sanctuary. He went inside, the click of the lock echoing in the stillness. He had a plan. It was a risky plan, one that could potentially escalate the situation, but he was past the point of appeasement. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. The subtle shift in his mindset, from victim to strategist, brought with it a strange sense of exhilaration. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, once a symbol of his solitary existence, now seemed to thrum with anticipation. The war, he realized, had just begun. The crisp Saturday morning air, scented with dew-kissed grass and the faint aroma of brewing coffee from a neighbor's house, did little to soothe the simmering tension Victor felt. He stood by his living room window, a mug warming his hands, and observed the brazen red of Caroline's car parked squarely in the middle of his driveway. It was a blatant disregard for their previous conversations, a deliberate act of defiance that tightened the knot in his stomach. He had tried politeness, he had tried assertiveness, but this was a declaration of war. Unbelievable, he muttered, the word barely audible, a wisp of sound against the quiet of the morning. A cold, hard resolve began to form in his chest, a glacial shift in his approach. He wouldn't be ignored. Not this time. He set his mug down, the gentle clink against the ceramic coaster a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Each step toward the phone felt heavy, weighted with the exhaustion of repeated confrontations. A part of him, a small, weary voice, whispered that it wasn't worth the fight, that perhaps finding street parking wasn't so bad. But another voice, louder and sharper, cut through the hesitation. It spoke of boundaries, of respect, of the simple right to access his own home. He reached for the phone, fingers hovering over the keypad as he searched for the number of the towing company. He felt a strange mix of emotions, a grim satisfaction, a flicker of guilt, and a heavy dose of resignation. This was it, the point of no return. The dispatcher's voice was a detached monotone, a stark contrast to the turmoil within Victor. He provided his address, the make and model of the offending vehicle, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hand. As he hung up, a wave of weariness washed over him. He watched from the window, a silent observer. As the tow truck arrived, its presence a stark intrusion on the otherwise peaceful street. The mechanical whir of the winch, the metallic groan as Caroline's car was hoisted onto the flatbed, were sounds that echoed the finality of his decision. He knew this would escalate the situation, but a strange sense of calm settled over him. He had finally taken control. The slam of a car door shattered the morning's tranquility. Caroline, back from wherever her errand had taken her, stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief as she took in the empty space where her car had been moments before. The color drained from her face, replaced by a mottled red that crept up her neck. Victor watched as her carefully constructed composure crumbled, her features twisting in a mixture of fury and bewilderment. He braced himself. "Are you being serious right now?" The words were clipped, laced with incredulity, as though the very notion of her car being towed was an affront to her existence. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a shard of glass. Victor stepped outside, his own expression carefully neutral. He met her gaze directly, his stance calm but firm. "We talked about this last week, Caroline. This is private property." His voice was even, devoid of the frustration he felt. He knew that any display of anger would only fuel her outrage. He had to remain the calm in the storm. "I was only gone for a short time," she retorted, her voice rising. "I'm on the HOA board. I can park wherever I want." Her hands gestured wildly, as if emphasizing the absurdity of the situation. Victor could practically see the internal monologue playing out behind her eyes, the indignation, the sense of entitlement, the utter disbelief that someone would dare challenge her authority. He took a deep breath, the crisp morning air a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, refusing to be intimidated by her outburst. He knew this was the crux of the issue, her perceived power within the community versus his fundamental property rights. "Being on the HOA board doesn't give you the right to park in my driveway, Caroline. I've asked you politely multiple times. This is trespassing." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. He saw a flicker of something akin to understanding in her eyes, a brief moment of vulnerability before it was quickly masked by a renewed wave of anger. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. The words were empty, a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from her. Victor felt a pang of sympathy, a fleeting understanding of the fear that must be driving her behavior. But sympathy wouldn't solve the problem. He had to stand his ground. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I doubt that," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. The calmness of his response seemed to further infuriate her, the lack of reaction fueling her frustration. She spun on her heel, her departure as abrupt as her arrival. He watched her go, the tension slowly draining from his body, leaving behind a strange emptiness. He knew this wasn't over, that her parting words were a promise of future conflict. But for now, the driveway was clear. He could finally park his car in his own garage. The small victory felt strangely significant. As he walked toward his house, he felt a sense of weariness, but also a flicker of resolve. He was ready for whatever came next. He would protect his peace, no matter the cost. The cool, metallic hum of the refrigerator vibrated through the otherwise silent kitchen. Victor stared at the screen of his phone, the blue light washing over his face, etching the shadows of his weariness deeper. The damn video was everywhere. He'd known the moment he pressed upload that it would create ripples, but he hadn't anticipated the tsunami. Each refresh brought a new wave of comments, a swirling vortex of opinions, most of which he couldn't bear to read. A hollow ache settled in his chest, a chilling premonition that the quiet life he'd envisioned in this new home was already slipping away. He'd hoped for a peaceful resolution, a neighborly chat over a cup of coffee, perhaps. Instead, he'd ignited a digital wildfire. He scrolled through the comments, each one a tiny barb digging into his skin. Entitled HOA Karen, one read. Another, he should have just parked on the street. The anonymity of the internet emboldened them, their words sharp and unforgiving. He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples, the throbbing a dull counterpoint to the incessant buzzing of his phone. He'd become a symbol, a pawn in some strange, online game of social justice. Was this truly the only way to be heard? The chime of his doorbell startled him. He hesitated, a flicker of unease in his stomach. Was it a reporter? A disgruntled HOA member? He wasn't ready for this, not for the real-world consequences of his online actions. Peeking through the peephole, he saw no one. Instead, a pastel pink envelope lay on his doorstep, secured by a decorative rock shaped like a sleeping cat. The saccharine sweetness of it felt almost menacing. He opened the door, the crisp morning air a stark contrast to the suffocating weight of the online world he'd just escaped. He picked up the note, the paper thick and expensive, embossed with a delicate floral pattern. It was undeniably Caroline. He unfolded it, his fingers tracing the sharp creases, a strange mix of anticipation and dread tightening his chest. Her handwriting was elegant, looping, each letter perfectly formed. Dear Victor, It began, the formality a thin veil over the passive-aggressive tone that followed. I noticed your concerns regarding parking. Perhaps a review of the HOA guidelines, specifically Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 4, would clarify the matter. The note ended with a flourish of her signature, a final, pointed jab. He felt a surge of anger, a hot, prickly sensation that spread through his limbs. She hadn't acknowledged his concerns, hadn't apologized for her behavior. Instead, she'd offered him a condescending lesson in HOA bureaucracy. He crumpled the note in his fist, the paper crackling a protest against the pressure. He wanted to scream, to hurl the note back at her door, to demand an apology. But the cold, calculated nature of her response stopped him. He knew instinctively that any outburst would only fuel her sense of superiority, validate her dismissive attitude. He retreated inside, the slam of the door echoing the turmoil inside him. The house felt smaller now, the walls closing in, suffocating him. He needed to breathe, to think. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid a balm against the burning in his throat. He paced the length of his living room, the rhythmic thud of his footsteps against the hardwood floor a grounding rhythm in the chaos. He thought of his reasons for moving here, the peace he'd craved, the sanctuary he'd hoped to find. It was all crumbling around him, piece by piece. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control. Caroline's note was a challenge, a subtle declaration of war. He wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let her bully him into submission. He retrieved the HOA rulebook from the stack of paperwork he'd yet to unpack. The thick binder felt heavy in his hands, a symbol of the bureaucratic labyrinth he now had to navigate. He flipped through the pages, the dense legalese blurring into a meaningless jumble of words. He scanned for the section Caroline had referenced, his fingers tracing the lines of text, searching for the loophole, the technicality that would give him the leverage he needed. Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 4. He found it, the words leaping out at him from the page. It outlined the designated parking areas, the restrictions, the exceptions. He read it once, twice, then a third time, each time a new layer of meaning unraveling. A flicker of hope ignited within him, a small, fragile ember in the darkness. The wording was ambiguous, open to interpretation. It didn't explicitly grant Caroline the right to park wherever she pleased. He could fight this. He could win. The weight on his chest began to lift, replaced by a surge of resolve. He wouldn't let her win. He wouldn't be another victim of her petty tyranny. The online attention, the viral video, it was all a distraction. The real battle wasn't on social media. It was here, in the quiet confines of his home, in the dense pages of the HOA rulebook. He poured himself another glass of water, the cool liquid a symbol of clarity, of focus. He had a plan. He would fight her, not with anger, not with online outrage, but with the very rules she claimed to uphold. He would dissect every word, every comma, every paragraph. He would find the weakness in her armor, the flaw in her logic. He would win this, not for the internet, not for the anonymous commentators, but for himself, for the peace he'd been promised, for the sanctuary he deserved. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. The game had changed. The air in the community hall hung thick with anticipation, a miasma of perfume, aftershave, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the rows of folding chairs. Victor sat near the back, a small, tightly rolled document clutched in his hand. He could feel the weight of gazes, some curious, some openly hostile, pressing against him like a physical force. He'd anticipated this, prepared for it. Yet, the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing second. This is it, he thought, the moment where civility gives way to what? Justification? Vindication? The thought felt hollow, a brittle shell against the rising tide of unease. He observed the room, a detached observer in his own drama. Mrs. Henderson, her face etched with perpetual worry lines, fussed with the arrangement of refreshments on a table by the door. Mr. Garcia, the retired accountant, meticulously polished his glasses with a microfiber cloth, his movements precise and economical. And there, At the head of the room, perched like a hawk surveying its territory, was Caroline. Her blonde hair, usually styled in a meticulous bob, was slightly disheveled, a subtle crack in her otherwise impeccable facade. Victor wondered if the viral video had finally managed to ruffle her composure. The thought, small and vindictive, offered a fleeting moment of satisfaction. He pushed it aside. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about principle. The meeting began with the customary drone of budget reports and landscaping proposals, each item punctuated by Caroline's crisp, authoritative pronouncements. Victor found himself struggling to focus. His mind kept replaying the events of the past week, the escalating tension, the final, unavoidable confrontation. He'd known from the beginning that moving into this seemingly idyllic neighborhood would be a challenge. A single man, in his late 30s, buying a house in a community dominated by families, he'd been an anomaly from the start. But he hadn't expected this. He'd hoped for a quiet life, a sanctuary from the relentless pace of the city. Instead, he'd found himself embroiled in a petty war over a parking space. The irony wasn't lost on him. Finally, the moment arrived. Caroline, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that felt more menacing than comforting, addressed the incident that had unfortunately gained unwanted attention online. Victor's hand tightened around the rolled-up document. "Here we go. As many of you are aware," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room, pausing just a fraction too long on Victor, "a disagreement occurred recently regarding parking regulations. While we encourage amicable resolutions amongst neighbors, it's deeply regrettable when such matters escalate to the point of public spectacle." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor could feel the collective gaze shift back towards him, heavy with judgment. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He wouldn't be goaded. He wouldn't let her frame the narrative. "I understand that Mr. Blackwood," she continued, her voice now tinged with a subtle reprimand, felt justified in his actions. However, the manner in which he chose to address the situation was, shall we say, less than diplomatic. She gestured vaguely towards the back of the room, where a laptop was set up. The infamous video paused on a frame of Victor standing beside Caroline's car, the tow truck looming in the background. The air crackled with tension. Victor's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. He rose to his feet, the rolled document now unfurled in his hand. "Mrs. Peterson," he addressed her formally, his voice steady and clear, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding. My actions were not only justified, but entirely within the guidelines of the HOA regulations, specifically Section 4, Subsection C, Paragraph 2, regarding the unauthorized parking of vehicles in designated fire lanes." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Caroline's carefully constructed facade finally cracked, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "I have here," Victor continued, holding up the document, "a copy of the regulations, along with photographic evidence of Mrs. Peterson's vehicle repeatedly parked in the designated fire lane, despite multiple polite requests to relocate her vehicle." He paused, letting the words sink in. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tide beginning to turn. The whispers grew louder, now laced with a different kind of energy, not judgment, but curiosity, even a hint of support. Caroline, regaining her composure with an almost visible effort, attempted to interject. "Mr. Blackwood, this is hardly the appropriate forum. On the contrary, Mrs. Peterson," Victor interrupted, his voice firm but respectful. "This is precisely the appropriate forum. This meeting is meant to address community concerns, and the consistent disregard for HOA regulations, particularly by a member of the board, is a significant concern." He proceeded to methodically lay out his case, citing specific instances of Caroline's violations, supported by the photographic evidence he'd meticulously gathered. With each piece of evidence, the whispers grew louder, the tide turning further in his favor. He could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of the other residents, the realization that they'd been misled, manipulated. The meeting concluded with a motion to review the HOA regulations and parking enforcement procedures. Caroline, her face pale and tight-lipped, sat silently, her usual air of authority replaced by a simmering resentment. As Victor gathered his things, several residents approached him, offering words of support, even apologies. He felt a surge of something he hadn't expected, not triumph, but relief. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he'd made his stand. He'd spoken truth to power. And in that small, fluorescent-lit community hall, he'd finally found his voice, his place. The Tuesday morning sun, a pale disk through the gauze of early mist, painted the dew-kissed lawn a shimmering emerald. Victor stood by his kitchen window, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee, the bitter aroma of familiar comfort. The quiet serenity, the gentle chirping of unseen birds, was a balm to the raw edges of his patience. It had been a tense few days, a silent battle waged over a strip of concrete his driveway. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the previous incident, the ignominy of having her car towed, would have been enough. He'd even entertained a flicker of empathy, imagining Caroline's embarrassment, the sting of public reproach. But the universe, it seemed, had a perverse sense of humor. A flash of metallic blue in his peripheral vision tightened the knot in his stomach. His breath hitched, the coffee suddenly turning sour in his mouth. It couldn't be. He set the mug down, the soft clink against the granite countertop oddly loud in the sudden silence. He moved closer to the window, each step measured, deliberate, as if approaching a predator. There was parked squarely across his driveway, the same obnoxious shade of blue, the same blatant disregard for boundaries. Caroline's car. She's back, he murmured, the words laced with disbelief. A strange calm settled over him, a cold, hard certainty. The initial flicker of anger had been replaced by a weary resignation, a quiet understanding that this wasn't about parking anymore. It was about power, about the unspoken rules of territory, about the subtle, insidious ways people exerted their dominance. He felt a flicker of something akin to pity, then immediately squashed it. Pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd tried reason, he'd tried politeness. He'd even resorted to the HOA, whose response had been a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. He was left with only one option. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with a practiced ease, dialing the towing company. "It's her again," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Same address. Same car." He listened to the dispatcher's board confirmation, the mundane details of the transaction a strange counterpoint to the roiling emotions within him. He ended the call, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "I'm done asking." He watched from the window, a silent observer, as the tow truck arrived, its flashing lights painting the quiet street in hues of red and blue. He saw Caroline emerge from her house, a whirlwind of floral print and fury. Her hair was a mess, her feet clad in fluffy pink slippers, the image so incongruous with the venom spewing from her mouth that it almost made him laugh. Almost. He watched her gesticulate wildly at the tow truck driver, her voice, though muffled by the distance, clearly carrying a high-pitched, indignant shriek. He imagined the words, the accusations, the threats, the inevitable invocation of her HOA status. He'd heard it all before. This time, however, he felt no urge to intervene, no desire to explain, to justify. He simply watched, a detached observer of the unfolding drama. The security camera, strategically positioned above his garage, captured the entire scene in crisp detail of the escalating argument. The tow truck driver's stoic indifference, Caroline's increasingly frantic gestures, the final, defeated slump of her shoulders as her car was hoisted onto the flatbed. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wasn't over. This was just another chapter in the ongoing saga of their unspoken war. But he also knew, with equal certainty, that he wasn't going to back down. He had crossed a line, a point of no return. He'd tasted the quiet satisfaction of standing his ground, of refusing to be bullied, of reclaiming his small piece of territory. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug a comforting weight in his hands. The bitterness, this time, wasn't unpleasant. It was a reminder of the hard-won lesson he'd learned, the understanding that sometimes peace came at a price. He looked out at the empty driveway, the space now clear, the morning sun glinting off the smooth concrete. It was a small victory, perhaps, but in that moment, it felt like a monumental triumph. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the taste a strange blend of bitter and sweet, the quiet of the morning finally, truly his own. He knew, with a deep, intuitive certainty, that this wouldn't be the last encounter with Caroline. He could almost anticipate the next move, the escalating retaliation, the subtle, insidious ways she would try to regain control. But this time he was ready. He had shed the last vestiges of his naivete, replaced by a steely resolve, a quiet understanding of the unspoken rules of the game. The peace he craved wouldn't be handed to him on a silver platter. He would have to fight for it, inch by painstaking inch, and he was prepared to do just that. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Victor's living room floor, the dust motes dancing in the golden light, a stark contrast to the unsettling quiet that had fallen over the neighborhood. He stood by the window, a mug of lukewarm tea forgotten in his hand, watching the tow truck disappear down the street. It was the second time in a week. Caroline's silver sedan, parked squarely over his property line, was gone. A strange mix of satisfaction and unease churned within him. He'd hoped for a peaceful resolution, a neighborly understanding. But Caroline seemed determined to push this strange, silent war. He wondered if she truly understood, or if she simply didn't care. Perhaps, he mused, some people derived a perverse pleasure from wielding even the smallest amount of power, a fragile shield against their own insignificance. The quiet didn't last. A rhythmic thumping from the shared wall announced Deshawn's arrival home. A few minutes later, a knock echoed through the house. Victor opened the door to find Deshawn grinning, his phone held out like a prized trophy. "This clip's going nuts," Deshawn said, his voice a low rumble of amusement. Somebody already made a remix with theme music. Victor's brow furrowed. He'd known Deshawn had been filming the towing, a silent observer perched on his porch steps. He hadn't expected this. On the screen, a sped-up version of the towing played, set to a dramatic orchestral score. Caroline's car, hooked to the truck, looked like a chariot being dragged off to Hades. He felt a flicker of discomfort. He hadn't wanted a spectacle. He just wanted to park his car in his own driveway. "It's Salat," Victor finally managed, the words feeling inadequate against the rising tide of online commentary scrolling beneath the video. He scrolled through the comments, a dizzying mix of support and condemnation. Some lauded him as a hero, standing up to HOA tyranny. Others accused him of being petty and vindictive. The internet, he realized, was a strange and unforgiving beast. It amplified everything, the good and the bad, distorting reality into a caricature. He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He'd hoped for quiet, for anonymity. Now, it seemed, he was the unwilling star of a neighborhood drama. Deshawn, sensing Victor's unease, clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't sweat it, man. Most people are on your side. Caroline's been rubbing folks the wrong way for years. This was just the straw that broke the camel's back." He paused, his smile fading slightly. "Though, you might want to lock your doors tonight. Crazy's out there." The words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the unpredictable nature of online fame. Victor managed a weak smile. He hadn't considered the darker side of viral attention. As dusk settled, the quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a charged silence, thick with unspoken opinions. He saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street, watering her petunias, her gaze lingering on his house for a beat longer than usual. He couldn't decipher the message in her eyes. Was it support? Pity? Judgment? He caught Mr. Jones, 2 doors down, giving him a curt nod, a subtle shift in his usually jovial demeanor. The community, it seemed, had chosen sides. He was a symbol now, a lightning rod for their frustrations. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't wanted this responsibility. He'd simply wanted to park his car. Later that evening, As he ate a solitary dinner, the phone rang. It was his mother, her voice tinged with concern. "Victor, dear, are you all right? I saw that video. It's all over the news." He sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd hoped to avoid this conversation. He reassured her, downplaying the situation, trying to project an air of calm he didn't feel. He knew she worried. He knew she saw him as vulnerable, still the boy who needed protecting. He wished, for a fleeting moment, that he could confide in her, tell her about the gnawing anxiety that was starting to take root. But he didn't want to burden her. He would handle this. He had to. After the call, he walked out onto his porch, the night air cool against his skin. The streetlights cast a pale glow on the empty driveway where Caroline's car usually sat. He looked up at the sky, a vast expanse of darkness punctuated by the distant flicker of stars. He felt a profound sense of loneliness. He'd moved here seeking peace, a refuge from the chaos of the city. Instead, he'd found himself embroiled in a conflict he hadn't sought, a battle for a few feet of asphalt that had escalated into something much larger. He'd become a symbol, a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath. The viral video, the whispers in the neighborhood, the silent judgments, it was all a consequence of his actions. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now he had to stand his ground. He opened his eyes, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. He would face this. He would find a way to navigate this strange new reality. He would find peace, even in the midst of the storm. The silence of his new home, once a promise of tranquility, now echoed with the phantom vibrations of unresolved conflict. Sunlight, filtering through the living room window, painted dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the shadows that lingered in Victor's mind. He traced the rim of his coffee mug, the warmth failing to penetrate the chill that had settled within him. The past weeks had been a slow, simmering descent into a strange, suburban battleground. He had envisioned quiet evenings, the scent of freshly cut grass, and a friendly wave of a neighbor. Instead, he found himself entrenched in a silent war over a patch of pavement. Caroline's icy demeanor, her dismissive wave of a manicured hand, replayed in his thoughts. Did she truly believe she was above the rules? He wondered, the bitterness a metallic tang on his tongue. He wasn't trying to be difficult, merely asking for the respect due to any homeowner. The HOA agreement was clear, the property lines demarcated. Yet, she persisted, her gleaming SUV a constant, unwelcome presence at the edge of his driveway. He'd tried reasoning, polite requests escalating into firm assertions. Each attempt met with the same condescending smile, the same air of untouchable authority. He glanced at the stack of neighborhood newsletters on his kitchen counter, each bearing Caroline's smiling face, championing community spirit. The irony was a sharp, twisting knot in his gut. Where was this lauded community spirit when it came to respecting his property? The thought brought a wave of weariness. He moved here seeking peace, not a petty power struggle. Was this the price of suburban bliss? A constant vigilance against encroaching SUVs and the inflated egos of HOA board members? The following days were a study in human nature. Some neighbors offered sympathetic glances, hushed whispers of Caroline's difficult personality. Others, perhaps intimidated by her position, avoided eye contact, their silence a tacit acceptance of her behavior. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Henderson, stopped him during an evening walk, his voice a low rumble. "Don't let her get to you, son. She's been running this place like her personal fiefdom for years." The words, though laced with weariness, offered a strange comfort. He wasn't alone in his perception of Caroline's overreach. One morning, he found a small, anonymously delivered basket on his porch. Inside, nestled amongst fresh-baked cookies, was a handwritten note. "Hang in there. We're rooting for you." The simple gesture, the quiet solidarity, warmed him more than he cared to admit. It was a small crack in the wall of indifference, a reminder that community wasn't just about power plays and parking disputes. The turning point came unexpectedly. He was returning home late one evening, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. Caroline's SUV, predictably, blocked part of his driveway. He stopped his car, the engine idling, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He could call the towing company, finally escalate the situation. But the thought felt hollow, a victory tinged with bitterness. He wanted resolution, not retribution. He got out of his car, the night air cool against his skin. He walked towards her house, each step measured, deliberate. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the stillness. The porch light flickered on, and Caroline opened the door, her face etched with surprise. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a quiet firmness he hadn't known he possessed. "Caroline," he began, his voice steady. "I understand you're busy, but this parking situation needs to be resolved. I've asked politely, I've explained the rules, and I've waited patiently. This is my property, and I expect it to be respected." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite remorse, but perhaps a recognition that her usual tactics wouldn't work. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. "I'm not interested in arguments or excuses. I'm simply stating a boundary. I need you to park your car within your designated space. Can we agree on that?" The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Finally, she nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. He acknowledged her with a nod of his own, turned, and walked back to his car. As he drove into his driveway, finally unobstructed, he felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the triumphant rush of victory, but the quiet satisfaction of having stood his ground. In the following days, Caroline's car remained within her property lines. The silent war had ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet setting of a boundary. The experience left him with a deeper understanding of the subtle dynamics of community, the unspoken rules, and the delicate balance of power. He learned that politeness wasn't weakness, but that true strength lay in the ability to assert oneself with calm, unwavering firmness. He sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was still, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves. He realized that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the ability to navigate it with grace and resolve. Boundaries, he mused, were not walls meant to isolate, but lines drawn to define and protect one's space, both physical and emotional. And sometimes, the quietest assertion of those boundaries could be the most powerful act of all.